Somewhere over the Black Sea, just before dawn on July 22, 2026, a tanker riding low with sanctioned Russian oil takes a hit at the waterline. No warship fired it. No sea drone skimmed the waves. The strike came out of the dark sky, a fixed-wing attack drone that had flown more than 200 kilometers to find one blacked-out hull in open water. By sunrise, 12 more ships carried the same scars. How 13 vessels were struck in 48 hours, and why Russia still cannot stop it starts here. This was not a single lucky night. It was the latest increment in a campaign that, by the third week of July, had already reported strikes on somewhere around 200 vessels since it opened on July 6. The name attached to it, announced through the commander's own Telegram channel, is Operation MoLoChKa, and the man who runs it has spent the last 3 years turning cheap flying machines into the most feared instrument on the Russian side of this war. His call sign is Madyar. His real name is Robert Brovdy, and he commands Ukraine's Unmanned Systems Forces, the branch known by its initials as the SBS. Understand one thing about this branch before we go any further, because most reporting gets it wrong. Brovdy's forces fly aerial drones. They do not operate the naval surface drones, the wave-skimming Sea Baby and Magura boats that sank Russian warships earlier in the war. Those belong to the security service and to military intelligence, different services entirely. What Madyar's people put over the Black Sea are long-range, one-way attack aircraft, fixed-wing, internal combustion engines, a warhead in the nose, and a camera feeding a pilot who may be sitting 300 kilometers away. That distinction is the whole story. Because when you learn that 13 ships were struck in 48 hours, your mind reaches for a picture of a speedboat drone racing across the water. Wrong picture. The correct picture is a small aircraft, wings barely 2 meters across, droning through the dark at a few hundred meters of altitude, guided onto a ship that thought open water was safety. Let's set the board. The target of this campaign is what the world calls Russia's shadow fleet. After Western sanctions capped the price of Russian crude and shut sanctioned tankers out of insurance in Western ports, Moscow assembled a patchwork armada of aging tankers, dry cargo ships, and tugs. They sail under flags of convenience, register through shell companies in a dozen jurisdictions, and switch off their transponders when they want to vanish. Their job is simple: move Russian oil and Russian goods out to buyers and move value back in, keeping the war economy fueled while pretending the cargo has nothing to do with the Kremlin. For most of the war, that fleet operated on an unspoken assumption. A ship far out at sea or tied up at a loading terminal well inside Russian-controlled waters was beyond Ukraine's reach. Coastal artillery could not touch it. Manned aircraft would be shot down long before they arrived. And the naval drones that had terrorized the Russian Navy needed a launch point close enough to matter. The tankers rode at anchor, lights doused, and their crews slept. That assumption is what Operation MoLoChKa was built to destroy. Here is the geography that makes it possible. The Black Sea and the Sea of Azov are, in the scale of long-range drones, not that big. From Ukrainian-held coastline, a fixed-wing attack drone with a range in the 200 to 300 kilometer band can reach anchorages off occupied Crimea, loading points along the eastern Black Sea coast, the approaches to the Kerch Strait, and terminals where sanctioned crude changes hands. The class of drone doing this work is the Firepoint family. The FP-1 and the newer FP-2, these are not tactical quadcopters. They are cheap, mass-produced strike aircraft designed for one flight, out and down onto a target, never coming back. And the economics are brutal in Ukraine's favor. A Shadow Fleet tanker is a hull worth tens of millions of dollars before you count the cargo. The drone that finds it costs a fraction of a percent of that. This is the asymmetry that has defined the entire drone war, now carried out to sea. A machine you could lose 100 of and barely notice. Hunting a ship that Russia cannot easily replace and cannot afford to lose. Remember that ratio. We will come back to what it did to Russia's numbers by the end of July. Now, the campaign did not begin on July 21. It began on July 6, and it built through the middle of the month at a pace that alarmed even the analysts who follow this war closely. Open-source intelligence channels tracking maritime activity in the region reported strike after strike, some nights quiet, other nights carrying tallies that topped 24 vessels in a single 24-hour window. By the time the July 21st and 22nd figures came out, the running total that Brovdy's own announcements pointed to had climbed past roughly 196 to 201 vessels struck since the operation opened. Not all sunk, struck. That word matters, and we will hold ourselves to it throughout. Because here is the honest frame this channel owes you. Every figure in this campaign traces back to one source, the commander's own telegram posts, echoed by Ukrainian outlets. The event, the date, the unit, and the composition of the July 21st and 22nd batch are corroborated across multiple reports. What is not independently confirmed is the fate of each hull. When Bravdi says 13 ships were struck, 1 tanker, 10 dry cargo ships, and 2 tugboats, we report exactly that. We do not upgrade a strike to a sinking. We do not invent a ship's name or a dollar figure that no one has verified. That discipline is what separates documentary from wishful thinking. And it is the only way the count stays credible as it keeps climbing. So let's go back 3 weeks and watch how a campaign like this is actually assembled, because the flying is the easy part. Finding the ship is the hard part. Everything begins with the picture. Before a single drone leaves the ground, someone has to know where the ships are, and the Shadow Fleet exists specifically to be hard to find. Its captains switch off the automatic identification signal that honest merchant traffic broadcasts. They loiter in anchorages, drift on purpose, and file false positions. Building a target list means fusing several streams at once. Satellite imagery from commercial providers catches hulls at anchor and at terminals. Radar sweeps and signals monitoring catch the ships that go dark. Pattern of life analysis catches the tanker that shows up at the same loading point every 11 days like clockwork. And there is human reporting, the quiet trade of information about which ship is where. Out of all that comes a folder. This anchorage, these coordinates, this many hulls, this loading schedule. A tanker riding high in the water is empty and worth less as a target. A tanker riding low is loaded, and a loaded tanker is both a bigger prize and a more spectacular one when the warhead finds the waterline. The planners want the loaded ones. Consider the problem from the Russian side, because the Russian commander responsible for protecting this traffic was not a fool. He had watched the naval drone attacks earlier in the war, and he had built his defenses against boats, booms across harbor mouths, patrol craft sweeping the approaches, machine gun positions along the piers, angled down at the water where a surface drone would have to come from, helicopters that could race out and strafe a speedboat before it closed the distance. Every one of those measures was designed to stop a threat coming across the surface of the sea. None of it looks up. That is the doctrinal gap Operation MoLoChKa drove a wing through. The men guarding the Shadow Fleet spent a year learning to watch the water. The drones came from the sky. A boom across a harbor mouth does nothing to a machine flying 200 meters over it. A machine gun bolted to a pier, aimed down at the waterline, cannot elevate fast enough to matter against something already diving. The Russians had armored the wrong axis. The first FP-1 crossed the coastline heading out to sea, and nobody on the ships below understood yet that the geometry of their war had just changed. But finding the fleet and reaching the fleet were still 2 different problems. The reach came next. The reach is a function of engineering, and Ukraine solved it the cheap way. A fixed-wing airframe of foam and composite, a small internal combustion engine sipping fuel, a fuel load sized for a one-way trip, and a warhead where a return flight drone would carry landing gear and reusable electronics. Because it never has to come home, every gram of weight that would have gone into surviving the mission goes instead into range and explosive. That is why these aircraft can cross 2, even 300 kilometers of open water and still arrive with enough charge to gut a hull. Guidance is the other half. Over open sea there are no roads, no tree lines, no landmarks to navigate by, just a flat gray plain stretching to the horizon. The drones fly on satellite navigation for the long cruise, corrected against Russian jamming that grows heavier the closer they get to occupied coast. In the final phase, a pilot takes the picture from the nose camera and steers the machine onto the specific point on the specific ship. The waterline amidships, the engine spaces aft, the bridge. A camera, a radio link, a human eye, and a hull that has nowhere to hide on an empty sea. Weather rules the calendar. A drone this light does not love a rough sea state or a stiff crosswind, and a low overcast can hide a target until the last seconds. So the operators wait for windows, and when a window opens over a rich anchorage, they surge. That is why the tallies come in bursts. A quiet stretch, then a night when the sky is clear and the ships are fat and 24 strikes land before dawn. Through the middle of July, those windows kept opening. Strike reports accumulated. And the men on the ships began to understand too late that anchorage was no longer safety and that darkness no longer hid them because the thing hunting them did not need to see running lights. It had their coordinates before it ever left Ukrainian soil. By July 20, the pieces for the next surge were in place. The target folder was full. The weather forecast for the following 48 hours showed the kind of window the operators had been waiting for. And somewhere along the Ukrainian coast, the launch teams began wheeling out airframes. Watch how a single strike in this campaign actually unfolds, because the numbers in a telegram post flattened 13 separate acts of engineering into one line. Each of those 13 was its own flight, its own pilot, its own hull. It starts hours before impact in the dark. At a dispersed launch site, a team of a few people, an airframe on a simple rail or a pneumatic launcher, a generator, a satellite link. No runway, no hangar, nothing a satellite would flag as a base. The engine catches, a flat mechanical buzz against the sound of the surf. The drone accelerates down the rail and climbs out over black water, and within a minute the launch site is packing up, because a launch point that stays put is a launch point that gets found. The cruise is long and boring, and that is the point. For an hour, maybe more, the aircraft drones out over the sea on its programmed track, sipping fuel, holding altitude, invisible to almost everything. Russian radar coverage over the open Black Sea is not seamless, and a small low-flying composite airframe returns almost nothing. The pilot, back on the coast, watches telemetry and waits. The dangerous part is not the crossing. The dangerous part is the arrival. As the drone closes on the target area, it enters the belt of Russian electronic warfare that thickens toward the occupied coast. Jammers hunt for the satellite navigation signal and the control link, trying to sever the drone from its guidance or its pilot. Some airframes are lost here, spun off course, driven into the sea, their signals swallowed. This is the pressure point of every mission, the gauntlet between open water and the target, and not every drone comes through it. The ones that do break out the far side with the anchorage ahead and the pilot now flying the nose camera by hand. Then the picture resolves. Out of the gray-green murk of a low-light sensor, a shape hardens, the long deck. The island superstructure aft. The subtle list of a ship riding low with cargo, a tanker. The pilot walks the aiming point down the hull to the waterline amidships where a warhead does the most damage, where seawater and structural failure finish what the explosive starts. Airspeed builds in the dive. The horizon tilts. The hull fills the frame. Impact. The feed goes to static in the same instant. A fireball blooms at the waterline of a ship that thought the open sea was a wall around it. On the deck, a skeleton crew scrambles in the dark. No idea where the strike came from, no target to shoot back at, radios crackling with confusion in the seconds after the blast. There is nothing to engage. The thing that hit them is already gone, spent, part of the wreckage. Somewhere on the Ukrainian coast, a pilot is already reaching for the next airframe. That is one strike. On the night of July 21 into the morning of July 22, that sequence ran to completion 13 times. One tanker, 10 dry cargo ships, 2 tugboats. Different hulls, different anchorages, different pilots, the same gray sky opening onto the same shocked decks. And here is the detail that should stop you. Not one of those 13 strikes came across the water. Every guard measure Russia had built, the booms, the patrol boats, the machine guns aimed down at the waterline, the helicopters ready to chase a speedboat, protected against an attack that never came. The doctrine written to stop naval drones was intact and useless, because the campaign that hit them was an aerial campaign the entire time. The Russians spent a year armoring the surface of the sea. Magyar's people simply went over the top of it. The 48-hour window closed. The tally went up on Telegram. 13 more vessels and a running total that had now pushed past roughly 200 ships since July 6. But a number on a screen is not the same as consequence. So what did all this actually cost Russia? Start with the ships themselves. A dry cargo vessel or an aging tanker in the Shadow Fleet is not a warship. But it is not cheap or easy to replace either, precisely because it is sanctioned. Russia cannot simply buy new tonnage on the open market and insure it through London. Every hull in the Shadow Fleet was acquired through the same difficult back channels that keep the whole enterprise alive, which means every hull struck is a hull that is hard to swap out. Damage one badly enough to pull it from service, and you have not just lost a ship, you have removed a scarce, hard-to-obtain asset from a fleet that was already scraped together from the world's older vessels. Then there is the tanker itself and the cargo it carries. A loaded tanker holds crude or product worth far more than the ship, and that cargo is the war economy in liquid form, revenue on its way to a buyer. Interrupt the movement and you interrupt the money. Do it once and it is an incident. Do it 200 times in a summer and it becomes a tax on every barrel Russia tries to move by sea. A risk premium that either eats the margin or scares off the intermediaries who make the shadow fleet function. The strategic squeeze runs through Crimea. Ukraine frames this whole campaign as a chokehold on the peninsula's fuel and trade lifelines, and the pressure point everyone watches is the Kerch Strait, the seam between occupied Crimea and mainland Russia. Ukrainian officials say ferry capacity across the strait has been cut by around 3/4. Cut the sea link, pressure the ferries, put every tanker approaching the region at risk, and you tighten the noose on the logistics that keep occupied Crimea supplied. That is the theory of victory behind Operation MoLoChKa. Not one spectacular sinking, but a grinding, cumulative denial of the sea to an enemy who assumed the sea was his. Hold these claims at the right distance, though, because the source discipline still applies. The 75% ferry figure is a Ukrainian assessment. The vessel tally is drawn from the commander's own announcements. What is solid is the pattern, confirmed across weeks by independent maritime tracking. That something is hunting the shadow fleet in the Black and Azov seas at a pace never seen before, and that the something is coming from the air. Listen to the Russian side of it, or rather the absence of a good answer. Milblogger posts through July carried a rising note of alarm about drones over the anchorages and the loading points, complaints that the fleet was exposed, that air defense over the water was thin, that the ships had no good way to protect themselves. The honest ones admitted the obvious. You cannot bolt an air defense system onto every aging tanker in a fleet of convenience. You cannot put a fighter over every anchorage around the clock. The shadow fleet was built to be invisible to regulators and insurers. It was never built to survive being hunted from the sky, and there is no cheap retrofit that makes a rusty tanker safe from a drone that costs a rounding error against the hull. That is the asymmetry from the top of this video, paid out in full. A machine Ukraine can build by the thousand, against a ship Russia can barely replace. Week after week through July, that trade ran in one direction and the ledger only moved one way. One more measure of consequence. The one that does not show up in a dollar figure: fear. Every shadow fleet captain who now approaches a Black Sea anchorage knows what the crews of those 13 ships learned in the dark before dawn on July 22. Open water is no longer empty. Darkness is no longer cover. Distance from the Ukrainian coast is no longer safety, because a drone that flies 300 kilometers does not care how far out you anchor. That fear reshapes behavior. Ships loiter differently, load differently, route differently. And every one of those adjustments is friction. And friction is exactly what a denial campaign is designed to manufacture. Which brings us back to the sky over the Black Sea and to the question from the start. Why can't Russia stop it? The answer is the shape of the thing. Russia built its defenses to stop a threat coming across the surface of the sea, and the threat came out of the air, cheap and patient and impossible to armor against ship by ship. To stop the campaign, Russia would need dense air defense over thousands of square kilometers of open water and over every terminal and anchorage the shadow fleet uses. And it would need it constantly. And it would need it against a drone that costs so little that shooting one down with a missile is a losing trade every single time. That defense does not exist. It may not be affordable to build. And while Russia works out whether it can, Magyar's crews keep launching from the dark coastline, one airframe at a time. Robert Brovdi built the unmanned systems forces on a single stubborn idea: that a cheap machine flown by a skilled operator can reach the things an enemy believes are out of reach, and take them apart at a price no defender can sustain. Operation MoLoChKa is that idea carried out to sea, against a fleet that kept Russia's war economy breathing. 13 ships in 48 hours was not the campaign. It was one entry in a ledger that has climbed toward 200 since July 6, and it will keep climbing. Because nobody has yet found the thing that makes it stop. The Shadow Fleet was supposed to be the part of the war that stayed in the dark. The dark is exactly where the drones do their best work.